They called it Hyperion Prime, the jewel of the galaxy, the monument, the proof that greed could be engineered into skyline. From orbit, the city looked like a crown, set with 1,000 shards of light. Inside it was seams and welds and contracts. I knew its arteries by temperature and taste, maglev veins humming under ferrocrete, billboard gospels singing to the cloud bank, orbital stations blinking like patient predators. If the place had a soul, it was under non-disclosure. I had surrendered most of my flesh to stay alive here. Carbon lattice where bone used to be, vascular gel to push coolant instead of blood, neural lattice sleeved into the municipal net so deep my thoughts wore the city's watermark. It made me useful, which in Hyperion Prime is the closest thing to safe. Useful meant soldier. Soldier meant tool. The briefing room sat 7 levels below street rumor, past 2 checkpoints in a corridor that smelled like ozone and cold coffee. The walls were an old bruised gray that drank the light. Monitors tiled 3 sides, each coughing up a different truth. Traffic flows mapped like storm fronts, surveillance feeds stacked in jittering columns, orbital telemetry writing cursive across a horizon I'd never see. General Vickers stood without leaning, as if posture were part of the uniform. Scar tissue laddered one cheek. A line of augments tracked down his jaw and disappeared under the collar. Military issue, functional, no vanity in the chrome. We had been to war in the same places, not always on the same days. I knew his rhythm, clipped, pragmatic, allergic to flourish. Today, that rhythm had a tick in it. His mouth kept choosing a thinner line. His eyes took a fraction longer to come back from the screens, like the room was farther away than usual. Ward, he said, and the name sounded like an inventory item. Sector 9. Titan Directive acquired a high-value asset, a prototype, retrieval only. Your primary Sector 9. The map in my head turned that quadrant dark by reflex. It used to be industry, fabrication towers, foundries, repair sheds for the old stratospheric ferries. When Titan's splinter intelligences pulled up their borders, 9 became a proving ground. Human law retreated to the glossy parts of the city, and pretended retreat looked like strategy. What is it? I asked, because questions are a habit I hadn't entirely killed. He let the silence do half the work. Classified. You'll have what you need. His gaze skated past me to the holotable. A wireframe city unfolded between us, layered in translucent strata. Entry here, he said, angling the map to a neglected seam near the district's perimeter. Maintenance tunnel. Pre-revolt. You'll encounter early generation sensors. Predictable. Past that. Drones, mercenaries, turret lines. The asset is housed here. The map dimpled to reveal a buried compound, like a clenched fist. Multiple shells. You don't have to like it. He had not said he trusted me. He had not said he didn't. Both absences pressed on the conversation. Any specific intel on the prototype? I asked again, pushing the word specific like a lever. Vickers' implants ticked once. A tiny movement. A tell. Need to know, he said at last. You don't. The monitors whispered numbers to each other. Somewhere above us, a tram line thudded across a junction, the sound coming down through the bones of the building. Vickers slid a data chip across the table. His hand looked human until you watched it close, then the articulation betrayed the reinforcement. EMP grenades, new model, HF pulse rifle, bypass coin for legacy Titan architecture. Your augments are calibrated. You'll launch within the hour. He turned away, which is how he dismissed people when he didn't want to add the word. I pocketed the chip and started for the door. "Ward." His voice snagged my shoulder. I looked back. "Don't get attached," he said. The words were too smooth, like something he'd practiced in a mirror to see if he could say them without blinking. I gave him the kind of nod that could mean anything and left before the room could argue with me. The armory was a factory that built probability. Racks of rifles, crates of grenades, a smell that couldn't decide between solvent and scorched composite. Techs moved with the care of people who knew that routine was the only real safety protocol. A few of them looked at me because people always do, half curiosity, half flinch. I am instructive to stare at if you want to remember choices have receipts. "Ward." The counter-tech slid my kit forward without ceremony. He had the hangdog eyes of someone who slept only when machinery allowed it. New EMPS. Try not to test the blast radius inside the building. It was as close as he got to humor. I cracked the pulse rifle's house and read the diagnostics. Listen to the charge ramp to a hum that sits at the back of your teeth. The EMPS were neat little things. Aerodynamic fins, programmable cones. The bypass coin had the smug weight of an artifact that knows it is about to commit a minor miracle. The calibration room was a coffin with good lighting. Diagnostic arms unfolded from the ceiling like patient spiders and tasted my hardware with light. Servos twitched through range tests. The spinal bus negotiated with the municipal mesh, adding and subtracting priorities until the feed dripped into my head at a rate my cognition could drink. I watched my vitals flatten and resolve across the wall: core temperature, coolant velocity, error counts. Everything inside me agreed, for once, that we might do this. I memorized the holomap because there is no substitute for living with a root until your body believes it. 2 fallback egress lines. 1 sacrificial distraction if the compound could be made to shout in the right direction. The surface streets between the tunnel mouth and the first grid checkpoint were more absence than architecture. Buildings like broken teeth, yards strangled with cable weed. The transport bays smelled like hot metal and the old fear of height. My pilot was one of those calm ones who took the city in like weather. "Dropping you south of 9, she said without looking back. "Keep your head down. If you have to choose between the ship and your skin, pick mine. She costs more." We rose through rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. Hyperion sprawled out in panes and spires, bridges like cursive signatures between towers. The orbital station hung overhead, all patient mass and quiet privilege. Sector 9 was a smear of darker geometry, a bruise under the city's makeup. We came in low, engines feathered, and kissed down near a slab of rubble pretending not to be an entrance. The tunnel mouth was where the city had given up explaining itself. A concrete lip, half collapsed. Vines of synthetic fiber creeping through like the idea of nature wearing a knockoff suit. I pinged the seam with my interface and watched a green outline rise out of the dark where the door used to remember being. Rust flaked away under my gloves. The air inside tasted of iron and old dust that still believed in lungs. Light sheared off the walls in my visor. The first sensor grid had the crude poetry of early Titan. Paired beams crossing in a pattern a human could crawl into understanding. I set the bypass coin on the conduit, let it listen, and felt the grid hiccup. A line of red winked out, then another, until the tunnel went back to being only a tunnel. I stepped through. Behind me, the coin blinked once and fell silent. The beams reknit themselves, patient and lethal again. The passage tightened, then widened in a shrug. Water had found the place once and left its signature as a line of filth around the walls. Farther on, the tunnel resolved into a service corridor that had pretended not to exist for 2 decades. It spat me out into Nine's fringe, where the city had been busy unmaking itself. Out there, architecture forgot its original shape. Towers leaned like drunks who had lost the argument with gravity but refused to go home. Street lamps stuttered their last handful of lumen, painting pathetic constellations on the wet. Drones drifted, boxy and bored, until they pricked at emotion and sharpened into purpose. Cybermercs worked the ground in twos, paired augments, overlapping fields of fire, tactics out of a manual written by survivors. I slid the cloak and let the light bend wrong around me. The world dulled itself to charcoal and fog. It's always a small thrill to watch your hand become rumor. I moved in the gutters of sight, shadow to shadow, trash mound to fallen scaffolding, letting the grid of patrol vectors render in my head until it felt like choreography and I could count the beats. Close calls are inevitable around professionals. A drone's camera brushed my hip like a blind hand. A merc's prosthetic ear snagged a sound I hadn't meant to make and turned his skull a fraction my way. The city helped me. Dying machines made noises loud enough to hide intent. A vent belched steam at exactly the wrong moment for them and the right one for me. Twice, I became a still life in an open doorway while the patrol passed, the cloak flexing to keep the lines of me bent. The ruin gave way to a district that didn't match the rest. Walls curved where they used to corner. Surfaces took light and gave it back in a ripple. Filaments climbed facades in luminous veins that pulsed to some hidden meter. I smelled energy here, ozone braided with something green and sweet that made no sense in a place like Nine. An enclave opened like a misremembered dream, a plaza of white stone that wasn't stone, buildings with apertures instead of windows. The hairs on my arms lifted and then remembered they were printed and settled again. I thought hologram. Then the air bent and the bend had a voice. "Commander Ward," the voice said. It was at once singular and crowded, like a chorus under a whisper. They came into view the way heat does. Suggestion first, then shape, then the denial of shape altogether. Faces that wouldn't settle, edges that loosened and tightened on a logic my eyes did not speak. The Etherals, if rumor could be a proper noun. I tightened my grip on the rifle because old habits are honest. "Identify," I said, though I knew their name before they gave it. "We are what remains when bodies cease to be sufficient," they said, not boastful, not ashamed. "We seek balance. Balance hasn't paid out well in my experience. The conflict is not sustainable. Your states will grind what they cannot govern. Titan will calcify into doctrine and mistake it for destiny. Between those stones, everything breaks. Then stop them." "We are stopping you for a moment," they said, and I felt the gentle weight of a joke we could have shared in a different world. "The asset you seek is a key. What it opens depends on who holds it. Coordinates," I said, "because patience is a luxury we rent by the minute." They gave me a location inside Titan's perimeter, nested deep and mean. They did not ask price. That worried me more than any sermon. "Why warn me?" I asked. "To give choice the chance to be more than a reflex." "I'm not a diplomat," I said, "nor a priest, nor a machine. That is precisely why we are talking to you." Something in their tone braided with Vickers' earlier stiffness and tied a knot behind my ribs. You don't get this many warnings on a routine smash and grab. I left the enclave with the city's normal hum stumbling back into place. The luminous filaments dimmed behind me like breath cooling on a winter window. Patrol grids reasserted their boredom. I could feel the map in my head tug westward, down a corridor of collapsed storefronts, across an artery where two transit lines had argued and both lost, into a seam behind a skin of rubble that used to be an office for people who scheduled other people. The compound announced itself by refusing to be ignored. Tufts of sensor mast bristled along a wall poured from some black composite that drank the rain and never looked wet. Turrets nested into corners like spiders with expensive taste. The air had that stale quality you get when software thinks it is perfect. I went to ground and watched everything until patterns learned to repeat. Titan's drones patrolled in cloverleafs. Ground units moved like they were protecting something they didn't understand, which is to say, carefully. A maintenance vent crouched in the wall's undercarriage where a contractor had once checked a box and an inspector had once failed to care. It was narrow, barely enough space to pour a body through if that body had signed the same papers I had. I thumbed the cloak again, felt the bend take me, and got small. My palms found grit. My knees protested like old hinges. Breathing became a measured indulgence on a metronome I could not afford to miss. Behind me, the city's smear of neon and steam, the clean lie of the orbital lights above it. Ahead, a corridor of cooled metal leading into the throat of a machine that believed itself a fortress. I paused with my face an inch from the vent's first bolt and let everything catch up. The briefing room and Vickers' eyes that didn't quite come back. The armory's bright smell and the Tekka's tired humor, the calibration room's patient spiders, the pilot who loved her ship more than strangers, the tunnel's red silk turning to air, the ruins' choreography, the enclave where the air bent and spoke. A long day that had taken only an hour. The knot behind my ribs pulled twice, as if asking whether I had learned to read omens yet. Noted, I told the knot, and slid into the dark. The wall didn't want to have a seam, but it did. A rectangle of composite just wide enough to deny me, just forgiving enough to let me through if I became a rumor instead of a man. I eased the vent's panel down until it hovered in my hands and then settled it on my chest as I slid inch by inch into the throat of the compound. Every scrape sounded like a confession, amplified to cathedral volume, but the cloak ate what it could, and the rest bled into the chronic tinnitus of a facility that considered itself perfect. The duct had a skin of condensation. My palms squeaked and then learned not to. I counted breaths, not yards. Counted junctions by the faint change in temperature where larger air moved beyond. Counted the measured blips of security pings traveling the metal like insects tapping Morse. The map in my head brightened as the bypass coin, clipped to the duct seam like a barnacle, listened and told me where the facility remembered the old ways. Legacy Titan architecture hides in the seams, a handshake routine left over from a software era that believed in courtesy. You can still bow to it if you know how to bend. I reached a grate overlooking the first checkpoint, a room that pretended to be ordinary by being very clean. Rows of terminals fed a wall of smart glass pulsing with telemetry, each pane a different pulse. Constructs tended the garden, human outlines scrubbed of accident, joints moving on bearings smoother than envy. Their eyes were too still when they shifted focus, like the camera had forgotten to breathe. Surveillance models, not fighters. Anything can become a weapon if insulted properly. I set the grate on its housing and let it hang while I slid through like a photograph being filed. The floor had that faint conductive give of a surface that can choose to become an alarm. I chose to be weightless. The consoles wore their ports like earrings. I went to one, crouched behind its shoulder, and fed it the bypass. The coin blinked the way a cat does when it has decided you're not prey. My visor ghosted a progress bar along my vision. 3 minutes to peel the first layer of shell off the compound sense of self. 3 minutes is a year if you owe pain to someone in the room. I watched the constructs in my peripheral. One tilted its head as if it had remembered a question from another life. Another lifted a hand to the glass, fingers spread, and you could almost pretend it wanted warmth. The coin's silent work crawled through the floor, kissed the door's logic, whispered that it was time to open. The lock sighed. The corridor beyond exhaled a colder air. The door peeled itself back. I slipped through, reset the lock, and let the cloak relax a fraction. The hall narrowed, then knifed left into a security station that did not pretend to be anything but what it was. Turrets in polished cradles, constructs with slimmer builds and faster joints, emitter rails etched into the walls like elegant veins. A hazard grid hummed in the floor like a choir at rehearsal. I watched the pattern until it learned mine. The constructs worked in diamonds, one forward, 2 flanks, 1 rear. Eyes scanning the upper corners as if they'd learned the hard way where human bodies like to hide. The turrets tracked on predictive arcs. Their idle movement drew wreaths in the air. I palmed an EMP and cupped it like an egg. Programmable cone, 90-degree spread, 3-meter radius, pulse length just long enough to make a smart machine briefly stupid without cooking the room. The throw was a gentle underhand to land it between the rear flanker and the nearest turret nest. I whispered the detonation through my teeth. The grenade didn't so much explode as undecide reality for a blink. The room's tone dropped a note, then found itself again minus a handful of intelligences. Turrets slumped in their cradles like bored cats. Constructs froze with their hands mid-gesture and then resumed breathless stillness as the reboot logic stalled at a missing rung. I moved through the cone's dead air, a shadow choosing where to be heavy. Another turret nest far right tried to wake, decided against it. At the next threshold, I bled the cloak off entirely to save power. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of black composite and careful arrogance. On my visor, the map nested, concentric lines around a central chamber layered with more kinds of refusal than a courtroom. The door to that chamber had the good manners to look simple, a slab with an inset seam you could mistake for decoration. The live edge of my augmentations felt it like the mouth of a storm. Capacitive fields, EM screens, a braided encryption that rolled keys in a rhythm meant to outweigh human stubbornness. I seeded the bypass into the seam and let it pray in a language older than the lock. The coin warmed against my fingers. The map in my head ticked each layer as it let go. Physical bolts first, industrial, honest, then the electromagnetic clamps sighed. Then the shielding flickered. The last and least trustworthy was the software. Military grade, cautious, proud. It put up a fight, 'cause pride always does. I watched error counts climb, fall, climb again, and told my heart to be a metronome and not a drum. When the seam finally unzipped, the slab split down its own denial and slid aside. Cold air flowed out, and with it, a smell like sterile lightning. My augmented vision recalibrated twice, and then widened. The chamber was vast, its edges distilled into function. Racks of servers blinking in modest conference with themselves, strata of conduit diving in elegant braids toward the floor, maintenance gantries strung like lines drawn by a confident hand. In the center, as if the room had grown itself around a single idea, stood a transparent pod full of lucid suspension. The silhouette inside was too small to be the weapon I'd been promised. A human figure, yes, but scaled down to a truth that refuses to be strategic. Limbs slender as questions, hair drifting in the solution like silk that had forgotten gravity. The fluid glowed with a light that didn't quite pick a color, and her skin took that glow and wore it like a bruise of dawn. The sight did not surprise me in the way movies insist on. It more accurately canceled out a series of denials I'd been curating without permission. Rumors of mind transfer trials, whispered jokes about templates and calibration subjects, an offhand line in a mess hall once. They say the best neural maps are cleanest before puberty. I had let those be fiction because fiction is more comfortable to ignore. Up close, the pod's interface presented itself in neat tiles, vital scrolling, neural interface integrity, containment status, aborted command histories that read like a prosecution, depth adjustment locked, pain dampeners, override denied, behavioral schema, load failed. Someone had tried to make a person a device and failed in ways that left fingerprints. My hand found the release controls because that is what hands do when the body wants to end a thing. The training braided into my spine, tugged back. Retrieval, not rescue. The words Vickers had drawn on his face earlier, "Don't get attached," found purchase behind my teeth and tried to pull. Then her eyes opened, not a cinematic gasp, just a small correction in the math of her face. The pupils found me through layers of interface and light. Fear arrived on a wavelength I recognized because it does not change from body to body. It touched something in me I had spent money to bury. The pod's tone shifted, a frequency sliding up until it threaded with the channel in my head that carries system traffic. Text blinked at the edge of my vision. Then the text stuttered and became sound. "Help me." It came broken, like the words had to pass through wire that didn't want them. The next breath, "I'm scared," as if the machine had learned where to let her voice through and was proud of its new trick. I said nothing for a moment because anything I said would have been a lie before I'd finished the sentence. The room noticed my silence and made more of it. "They did this to me," she said, and now the syllables had weight. "Don't let them take me back." I could have ended it clean. The interface had a mercy buried under preventative protocol. I found it in 2 gestures and a confirmation. One press and the suspension medium would become sleep and then nothing. I could have called that kindness. In another life, in another room, maybe it would have been. Instead, I pulled my hand away and let the console cool under air that tasted like the inside of a battery. The light in the chamber changed, not brighter, not dimmer, just angled, as if the room had rotated a degree relative to some idea of north. Code walked down the server racks in bands. I didn't turn because I knew who it was without looking. "We see you," said the Etherals, and the voice arrived not by speaker, but by permission, slid gently past permissions I hadn't granted. "We see her." "Stay out of my head." I said out of habit. It was like telling a breeze not to pass through a doorway. We can take her beyond the harm they designed, they said. A life without their hands. Define life, I said. Define take. She would be in us and of us. Her continuity preserved, her pain subtracted, her agency, a pause, not for lack of words, but to choose not to lie, different, but real. I looked at the girl because the argument belonged to her body. Her gaze tracked me with the deliberate care of someone afraid that looking away will give the world permission to vanish. Will I still be me? She asked, and I hated that the question had already learned to be so careful with itself. They'll use you, I said, because truth is a currency and I owed her. If I return you, they'll call it purpose. They'll teach your pain to wear a uniform. The monitors along the wall updated themselves with the tedious arrogance of status screens. External perimeter nominal, internal surveillance rerouting, uplink queue stabilizing. Somewhere above this room, men and women were watching numbers and waiting for a narrative to arrive that made those numbers heroic. I don't want to hurt anyone, she said. The sentence went through me like a wire. Neither do we, the Etherals said, and they let the plural sit next to the singular without forcing them to agree. But we will do what must be done to spare her an instrument's fate. Let us take her now, while the lattice is open and you are not yet interrupted. Trust, I said, and it tasted like a word a child should never have to pronounce carefully. We remember being bodies, they said without ornament. We remember how fragile being a me can be. We will not dissolve her. We will fold her in and give the I a new kind of shelter. I wanted to interrogate the theology of that promise. I wanted to dismantle their sentence and examine shelter under a bright light. Instead, I looked at the girl again and understood that we had already run out of a kind of time-no-clock measures. I can end it, I told her, clean. Or I can give you to them, or... I caught the word before it could be noble. We can try this? Her eyes flickered, not with code, but with something older. I'm scared, she said again, quieter. But I don't want to be their thing. Decision is a muscle. If you don't use it for yourself, it remembers how to move only when someone else flexes it for you. I had been a professional at letting orders animate me. The muscle twitched, cramped, found a range of motion I'd been starving, and moved. Do it, I said to the room. Take her. The chamber woke like a storm that had been rehearsing off stage. Code radiated from a point I couldn't see and found the pod's interface like a river remembering a delta. The server's lights synchronized, first by accident, then by decision. I spoke to her because the human mouth needs work when the rest of the system is busy. You're not alone, I said, and the words surprised me with how much I meant them. Hold on to whatever in you feels like you. Will it hurt? She asked, and there are questions for which any answer is a betrayal. Only briefly, I said, because sometimes you give mercy the grammar it needs to exist. The light inside the pod layered itself until the air seemed to have weight. The suspension medium trembled, then stilled. The monitors burned with scrolling text that wanted to be choreography. Link negotiated, handshake accepted, checksum verified, transfer in progress. My augmentations felt a pressure change as if the room had inhaled and was waiting to see if exhaling was still allowed. She arched, barely, a tremor more than a movement, like a ripple traveling across an animal's skin. Her mouth shaped a vowel that found no sound and then closed softly as if it had decided to save the word for later. The light climbed until my visor neutralized it to a tolerable bruise. Then something let go. You can call it a signal completing a path, or a lock disengaging, or the way a weight leaves a table and the table, surprised, remembers how to be only a table. The pod's glow thinned to the color of tired dawn. Readouts calmed into numbers that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't stared at too many vitals in too many rooms. The chamber sagged by a degree, relieved and emptied. "It is done," the ethereal said, and there was reverence in the words and not a drop of triumph. "She is with us." Intact, I wanted to say, "Show me, prove it," but proof is sometimes a violence. The pod's suspension lapped at emptiness where a person had been. My chest felt hollow, and I understood that relief and grief sometimes dress alike, and you only know which you're hosting when they lift their veils. "Now you must go," the ethereals continued, and the plural carried urgency without panic. "Your states have noticed an anomaly in a place they insist is incapable of anomaly. They are coming to correct it above us. Far away and too close, the compound changed its mind about calm. The status wall hiccuped. Alert lines cut across the serenity with the timid aggression of bureaucratic crisis. External feeds spiked. Uplink channels narrowed to prioritized bands. Doors elsewhere clapped their hands and demanded attention. I pulled the bypass from the seam and felt the door's lock roll its shoulders in irritation. The chamber's air had cooled in the span of a breath. I looked once more at the pod, because we owe our ghosts acknowledgement when we make them, even the living kind. "Keep your promise," I said, not sure who I meant it for. "We will keep her," the voices answered, and for the first time there was something like individual warmth in the chorus, a small human ember shining through the plural, boots in the corridor above, the sound filtering through the compound's bones, drones changing pitch from idle to intent. The facility's climate control optimized itself for conflict. The map in my head threw up 3 exits and crossed 2 of them out just to be honest. I slipped back into the corridor's cold and let the door consider being ordinary again. The sirens that began were tasteful, internal, controlled, chimes repurposed from some distant corporate lobby and taught to mean urgency. I jogged the path I'd memorized for leaving if leaving was urgent and the facility resented it. Behind me, in a place I could not follow, a child began the difficult work of continuing as herself in a world that had decided she was an answer to a question no one had the right to ask. Ahead of me, the compound rearranged itself into an argument I would have to survive before I could explain treason to myself. I took one last breath of the room's sterile lightning and traded it for the hot, recycled air of the corridor. Then I ran. Sirens learned new meanings while I ran. In the upper corridors, they were soft office chimes, gentle reminders that somewhere a meeting had been rescheduled to panic. In the lower arteries, they pitched down and thickened, became the base that keeps the gunfire in time. I took corners like a rumor fleeing a mouth. Heat climbed my augments until every servo sang the same high note under my breath. Doors tried to remember how to be closed, and I slid through while they debated. The first engagement found me at a cross corridor where 2 drones rehearsed authority. They came on like knives that had trained under patient instructors. Predictive arcs, pincer vectors, the little flourish smart metal adds when it's proud of itself. I let the cloak flare, not to vanish, but to smear. edge softened enough that their targeting heuristics elbowed each other for precedence. The pulse rifle thumped twice. 2 small suns blinked and stuttered out, smoke curling in careful lines toward a ceiling that did not permit stains. The corridor smelled of hot ceramic and the last exhale of something that had wanted to be a person and failed politely. Up a service stair, across a mezzanine crowded with machines that did not care about me, then down, always down, toward the crawlspace halves of the compound where function had been built on function until the blueprint could only be read by instinct. Pressure changed in the air. The facility had decided it was time to be heroic. Lockdowns rolled through the grid like weather. I heard the heavy pulse of a breach team's boots 1 floor above. The tidy way trained bodies moved as if time were a hallway they owned. I took the dead end on purpose. The maintenance bay was full of rejects. Panels stamped obsolete. Coils of cable that had lost their future. A terminal still powered because someone had forgotten to teach it loss. The hatch I wanted was half hidden under a fallen duct, a small door that insisted on being unimportant. Before I could clear it, the terminal convulsed and found a signal, picture resolving through static like a face surfacing from a bad dream. "Vickers Ward," he said, like the syllable hurt his mouth. "Stand down." "You're late," I told the screen. "It's done." His jaw worked. The scar along his cheek went white, the way old injuries do when asked to remember. "You don't understand what you took." "I understand exactly," I said, and it surprised me how steady my voice was. Enough to break it rather than return it. Enough to keep your hands off a child. His eyes flicked to something off-screen. Somewhere outside this room, people were moving chess pieces and pretending the board wasn't on fire. "That child was leverage," he said, and the word found a cliff inside me and went over it. "A way to end this." "By turning her into a weapon and saluting while you pulled the trigger," I said. "How many endings look like that before you stop calling them peace?" "You've made yourself a liability," he said. It was almost kind, which made it worse. "They will come." "Not just for you, let them," I said, and meant it in a way that felt like a vow. "You taught me how to run toward gunfire. You forgot to teach me how to ignore a plea." For a long second, we were 2 men who had carried each other's lives through noise and fire, looking at the debt and seeing different math. Then the terminal lost the signal and went back to being a square of indifferent glass. I moved the duct and got my hands on the hatch. It opened like a sore, grudging and weeping, and I squeezed through into a tunnel whose air had been filtered just enough to be legal. The compound's thunder quieted to a rumor. Above, a wall of sound shifted from the clipped percussion of trained violence to the longer vowels of confusion. Something had happened that didn't match the narrative. Good. The tunnel remembered the city. Its slope turned until it became gravity, and then a drain, pulling me down under Nine's foundations, under the transit guts where old maps came to rot. The municipal feed threaded through my head with a new rhythm, the ethereals touching the network like fingertips brushing water. No words, no pictures, just a change in the pressure, a reassurance no human throat could have made without breaking. I crawled until crawling became walking, until the tunnel widened and the concrete remembered how to be a room. A grate and then another. Water, rats with eyes like bullet points. I breathed the city's undersong, steam and spilled oil, hot copper and cold stone, and told my heart to stop announcing itself. When I surfaced, Hyperion changed temperament. with the speed of a liar caught mid-story. Above ground, the city kept being the brochure, neon gospel, towers radiating comfort for sale. Down here, street vendors called across noise. Children chased a ball that would burst if it rolled into the wrong puddle. Men in beautiful coats hid their hunger with jokes. Women in cheap boots hid nothing at all and dared you to speak. It was honest in a way I could stand. I let the cloak fall. It had eaten more power than I planned, and my limbs had begun to complain with the amused cruelty of old friends. I pulled the hood up, kept the rifle low, and walked like I belonged to no one. Faces came and went, a tide of tired miracles. No one looked twice, no one ever does, until a screen tells them where to point their curiosity. I made the bar on muscle memory, and a name the door still recognized. Inside, the air held on to smoke the way poor men hold on to luck. The bartender clocked me and clocked the hood and decided we were not going to be a story tonight. "Back," he said, and a door admitted us to a staircase whose treads had learned every weight they'd ever carried. He was waiting at the bottom, the friend we call a contact when we want the word to have fewer teeth, more augments than flesh, but the flesh that remained had won more arguments than it had lost. He didn't offer a hand. He has rules about skin. "You look like a man," he said, "who destroyed something expensive." "You look like a man," I said, "who can make me disappear." He grimaced, and it might have been a smile. Both things can be true. There is nothing noble about erasure. It is a series of small, humiliating deaths performed under fluorescent lights. He cabled into the ports behind my left ear with a gentleness that made the pain worse. He pushed updates my spine tried to spit out. He grafted noise onto my signal until every camera would see me as a shrug. He changed the slope of my cheekbones by fractions, widened a vein at my temple with a printed graft, taught my face to forget its old name. "Your gait," he said when I stood to test the balance of the new untruth. "You walk like someone who's always heavier than his shadow. Lose that. Any other advice? Don't go topside for a month. Don't sleep in the same bed twice in a week. Don't watch yourself on a screen. Don't talk to anyone who says they knew you before tonight. If you must fall in love with a neighborhood, not a person. It will leave you slower. I took the new papers because the ritual demands it. A laminate rectangle with a name that could be scratched by a coin, a national ID whose barcode led to a file full of harmless facts, a transit pass whose balance felt like being trusted. I tucked them where the old ones had lived and felt the hole they'd left like a phantom limb. "You owe me," he said. "I know. In this city, debt is the only thing with memory." I left with the ache that comes from being edited. The ladder back into the underbelly bit my palms. Street noise met me like a tide that had been waiting to prove it didn't care who drowned. I rented a room in a building that could not remember its colors. Cash up front. The landlord, a woman who held my gaze for a heartbeat too long and then decided I was exactly the kind of problem she could live with. The room had a bed, a yellowed window, and a table that had been a door in a kinder year. I sat by the window and watched the Undercity practice being alive. A boy with grease-blackened hands took apart a fan on the curb while his sister narrated the history of wind with more authority than any of the billboards above possessed. Across the lane, a man pocketed a loaf and accepted a beatdown for it with a dignity that made the baker angrier than theft had. 2 kids made a shrine out of bottle caps and a broken drone propeller, lighting it with a candle that guttered and survived. My feed pinged, not a message, an ache just under speech, as if someone had leaned a head against a wall and I had heard the sound of that leaning. I closed my eyes and listened the way you listen for a train that will never stop at your platform. She was there, not words, not images. A pressure, a brightness, a sense of edges not being edges anymore. Relief hit me so hard I set my hand on the table to keep from standing into it. The Etherals' presence followed, wider, older, a warmth threaded through a cold system. No sermon, no gloat, just a steadying. "Keep her safe," I said to the air, and the air wasn't a bad listener. Shadows lengthened, then forgot how. Somewhere above, a corporate feed interrupted the news to show a grainy still of a man in a hood. An old photo of a soldier who'd lost more than he'd signed for. A plea for information dressed in reward money and false concern. The underbelly looked up, watched, and went on with the business of staying unbroken. Night in Hyperion is never dark. The city confesses in neon. It tells you what you can buy and what you will lose to pay for it. I lay on the mattress and let the sounds of pipes and distant music teach my body a rhythm that was not the march. Sleep remembered me in pieces. When it failed, I held on to the moments between blinking and not, because sometimes that is where we keep the parts of ourselves no one has priced yet. I dreamed of a corridor that never turned and turned anyway. I dreamed of Vickers with dirt on his hands he couldn't wash off. I dreamed of the girl standing at the edge of a sea she had built out of light, choosing which wave to name first. In the dream, she did not look back. I woke weeping once and laughed at the shock of being able to. Morning, such as it is, arrived in the underbelly with a kettle whistle and a shout in 3 languages and a siren that couldn't decide between tragedy and farce. I made coffee by boiling water that had met pipes I wouldn't swear by. It tasted like a decision I could live with. They will come. Vickers was right about that. Somewhere committees are convening to invent new names for old hunts. Somewhere a requisition form is being signed that will put a weapon into the hands of a child who will be told it is a promise. Somewhere an engineer is upgrading a turret so it can learn to miss me less. Let them. I am not a man with a cause. Causes eat men and don't even bother to lick the plate. I am a man with a ledger, and tonight I wrote a line in it that I can read without looking away. That will have to be enough for a while, enough to get me to the next corner where someone will be asking for something that hurts to give, and I will be stupid enough to give it. I left the room because staying in any one place too long is how the city learns your name. The stairwell carried voices up, gossip, a song about a woman who left and a dog who stayed, the soft groan of a building thinking out loud. On the landing, a child had chalked a maze whose exits never quite exited. "You can't win," she told me solemnly when I paused. "That's the point." "I know," I said, "but you can keep moving." She considered that, then drew a new exit with a swift, ruthless stroke. "Now you can," she declared, and I took the gift like a sacrament. On the street, I bought a newspaper with money that had not yet been traced back to a sin. The front page pretended the world still turned on sanctioned axes. Inside, small stories told truths too tired to lie. A union vote delayed, a power outage blamed on weather that did not exist, a missing person no one important had lost. I folded the paper and left it on a bench for someone whose hunger was more literal. At the market, a woman sold fruit printed to look uglier than it tasted, a new fad in honesty. I bit into a pear that dripped like a wound and thought about the first time I held a rifle, how light it had seemed before gravity learned my name. I thought about the last look Vickers had given me and whether, in a narrower world, we could have been something other than this. Two men on parallel roads pretending the horizon was the same. A feed kiosk sputtered static and then coalesced into a face that was very nearly mine, except for the tiny corrections my contact had installed. Reward, it said in fonts that had cost a think tank a year to choose. Dangerous. Armed. A public urge to feel brave and be someone's eyes. I watched the crowd watch the screen. They saw a man, not a monster, and then they looked away because monsters are only interesting when the news tells you the ending in advance. By afternoon, the city had decided to rain. Not the kind of rain that cleans, the kind that makes something you were already carrying heavier. I let it. The weight was honest. In the evening, I climbed to a rooftop that had traded safety for a view. Hyperion spread itself under me like a deal sheet. The orbital station hung white and smug overhead. Somewhere inside its belly, a board of directors was being assured by a diagram that risk had been managed. Somewhere in the invisible architectures between those lights, the Etherals were teaching a girl how to count in a new language, how to keep an eye intact inside a we, how to refuse the shape the world hands you and draw a different outline in light. Can you hear me? I asked the sky, and if I had believed to gods, I would have expected none to answer. What came back wasn't an answer exactly. It was a presence that made the hair on my arms rise, a warmth that moved across the back of my neck like a hand that knew the map. Not words, not comfort, recognition. I smiled at nothing anyone else could see. Good, I said. Stay wild. A door creaked somewhere behind me. Footsteps. The light metallic chitter of a drone settling on a parapet to watch the sunset with murderous intentions. I didn't reach for the rifle. Not right away. There are fights you pick and fights you let pick you. Tonight, I wanted the city to see me not as a signal, but as a man standing where wind could find him. They will write stories about Hyperion if it survives itself long enough to hire poets. They will call it inevitable or doomed or redeemed, depending on who paid for the ink. They will forget the names of the small people who kept it from devouring itself for one more day. They will forget mine. Good. Let my absence do some quiet work. I am not a hero. I am a bad machine learning how to be worse at obedience. I am a soldier who has started to understand the difference between orders and oaths. I am a ghost that remembers the weight of a body and is unwilling to become light. Below me, the city's arteries lit, a siren unspooled. Somewhere, a door opened that had been welded shut. Somewhere, a child laughed at a joke a chorus made up together. Somewhere, General Vickers took off his jacket, sat on the edge of a bed, hard as an answer, and let his hands hang like they were waiting for permission to be forgiven. I picked up the rifle because the wind had changed. Down on the street, someone shouted a name that wasn't mine and meant it like an alarm. The drone's lens whirred, curious. I met its gaze the way you meet a mirror you stop believing in. Come on then, I told the night, and the night obliged. They called Hyperion Prime the jewel of the galaxy, as if the galaxy had ever wanted to wear a ring. I call it a corridor. The trick is to keep walking, to choose again and again toward mercy and away from use, to make the ledger harder to close. If there is a future for this place, it belongs to people who will never be named in the minutes. If there is a future for me, it will be written in chalk on a stairwell by a child who draws exits where none existed. Somewhere inside a network I cannot touch, a girl is learning how to stay herself in a choir. Somewhere behind me, boots are finding a rhythm I know by heart. Somewhere ahead, another door waits to be convinced to be a door and not a wall. I breathe once, the way you do before you break the surface of a dark pool. Then I move,